This podcast is brought to you by sarahraven.com, which is home to everything you need for a truly beautiful and productive garden. You'll also find great and essential gardening kit and stylish, lovely things to have in your house to bring the outside indoors, all inspired by the garden and the house being tied together. There's also plenty of garden inspiration, how-to videos and specialist growing guides. So head over to sarahraven.com today to discover even more. Welcome to Grow Cook Eat Arrange, the podcast of me, Sarah Raven, and a really fantastic merry crew of guests. And today I am joined by Richard Rickitt. Now, Richard is just the most extraordinary expert on bees. So particularly on honeybees, but actually the thing that I have found absolutely fascinating in his just out book called Beekeeping for Gardeners is not so much about the beekeeping, but for me, it's about the wild bees, because I'm not a beekeeper, because Adam, my husband, is allergic to bees, and if he gets stung, we just don't quite know what will happen. So we had to stop having honeybees in our garden, but we still have lots and lots of wild bees. And I've just so enjoyed reading the whole section on what we can do to help our wild, solitary and bumblebees. And Richard seems to me to be the great living expert in the UK. So welcome, Richard. It's so nice to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks. Lovely to be here.
Can you just tell us all a little bit about your background? So how you've come to just have this encyclopedic knowledge of not just honeybees, but all bees?
Well, it's quite a long story. I grew up in Surrey, but what I wanted to be more than anything was a farmer. I loved farms. My best friend was a farmer and so on. And then the most miraculous thing happened, which was when I was 7, my parents got the good life bug and we moved from Surrey to Somerset and they established a small holding. And this was just wonderful. So we had sheep and pigs. I had my own Jersey cow that I had to milk every morning by hand before I went to school.
Wow.
Doves and all sorts. Yeah, it's just the most wonderful childhood. Loved it. Absolutely loved it.
What age?
So we moved to Somerset when I was 7.
Okay, yeah.
So absolutely perfect. Nothing better than being lost out in the fields all day. Made friends with all the farmers. I'd get up early every morning to go and do the milking with the local farmers. I'm sure I was a bit of a nuisance, really. And doing all sorts of, it must have been a health and safety nightmare, climbing all over the equipment and whatnot. But I was actually in 7th heaven. And that was reflected, I suppose, in my academic, I hesitate to call it a career, but at school, I absolutely loved all the wildlife stuff. We had a little primary school where we could dabble in a pond and so forth. It was great. And my mum used to go to smallholder meetings and you'd go to each other's smallholding. And I remember very clearly, we went to one lady's house. She was all about goats. She had lots of goats. And my wife will tell you, if I'm in a crowd, I'll turn around and wander off in a different direction and see what everybody else isn't looking at.
Yes.
And I wandered off into her garden and there was this wooden box and I knew it was a beehive. But for some reason I thought, I'll just take the lid off and look inside. So I took off the roof and there were just these tens of thousands of bees. They all flew up in my face. But weirdly, I wasn't all that scared. I was intrigued by it. I quickly put the roof back on and I'm sure they found it later in a sort of slightly disassembled state. So I was slightly scared by it. But that was it. I was fascinated.
But you weren't stung?
No, I wasn't stung.
Amazing.
No. Yeah. Which I'm sure probably that would have been the end of it. Probably would have put me off for life. And I went to a fairly rural secondary school and it had a rural studies department. I don't know if those even exist anymore. So we had some sheep and goats and things like that. And it had a beekeeping club.
Wow.
And I joined the beekeeping club and that's where I first learnt to keep bees. I never had bees at home. But there was an old chap in the village, his name was Mr. Crisp, and I used to peek through the hedge and watch him tending his bees, beautiful old white WBC, classic British garden scene, and he'd be puffing away on his pipe, and I was always so intrigued by it, and once or twice he let me into his garden to look at his hives. Anyway, so that's the backstory, and I was always intent on being a farmer and having a rural life, but at some point, my dad was into photography, that was part of his job, and I had lots of old second-hand cameras and I got into filming things and photographing things. And I ended up working in the film and television industry in special effects for about 20 years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which was I would never have expected it, but I loved it, absolutely. But I got into doing things at a time when if you wanted to do a special effect or something, you had to scratch your head and go and get a fish tank and some string and work out how to set fire to something. It was all about making things and working it out. By the time I was in the industry, it was all about computers and digital whatnots.
Yeah.
And the joy kind of gradually ebbed away. So anyway, we moved out of London down to Wiltshire, where I live now, near Bath, which we thought was a better place for the children. A small garden, so I instantly got chickens and all that sort of stuff. And I kept saying to my wife, I must get back into bees, And then for my birthday, my wife, and I'm sure she's regretted it every day since, signed me up to the local beekeeping course. And it changed a lot in that time, because one of the things that had come along since my early encounter with bees was varroa, which is this horrible parasitic mite which causes awful problems for bees and caused a lot of people to stop keeping bees. So that was when, in the 90s, there was a massive decline in beekeeping in the UK, because we just didn't know how to really cope with this bug. So anyway, I got really into honeybees, and then, like a lot of beekeepers, you're obsessed for a while with honeybees, and that's the only bee in the world, and it's all about getting honey, blah, blah, blah. And then you start realizing, well, actually, there are a lot of other bees out there as well, and bit by bit you notice them because you're out in the fields with your own bees, you're paying a lot of attention to what's flowering in the hedgerows, you see there are other bees visiting, and increasingly I became more interested in the wild species of bee that we have in the UK, and really they became a sort of secondary obsession, but now I'm probably more interested in those than anything else. And actually that's the way that beekeeping has got. I mean, I've got hundreds of beekeeping books dating back to the 1600s, believe it or not. And you never, very, very rarely read anything about any other form of bee other than honeybees. It's as if they're the only bees on the planet. Occasionally they'll say, and they're bumblebees, and we're going to tell you about those because this is how they're different or how they're inferior to the honeybee, but they're just not thought of. But beekeeping's changed, and many beekeepers now, although they love their honeybees, pay a lot of attention to the wild species and their needs.
Because basically, in the main, what's good for honeybees is also going to be good for our wild bees. So the two you can extrapolate mainly. I mean, I know they live a completely different life, which we're going to come on to, in that most of them don't produce honey and they don't live in hives or in groups, do they? Anyway, we'll come on to that. But so that's an overall trend that you're seeing, that for biodiversity, people are increasingly interested in the plight of all bees.
Absolutely. And many beekeepers, I mean, you see photographs of people in the old days with 20, 30 hives, 40 hives in one place. But many beekeepers, particularly in urban areas, are in fact bringing down the number of bees they're keeping. They're conscious of the fact that there is a potential problem, particularly in urban areas, of there being too many honeybees and not enough forage to help the wild species. So, in fact, many beekeepers now keep fewer bees or keep them in a more sensitive way. Okay. Particularly, I mean, there are some areas in the country where there are some very rare species of wild bee, and it's best not to keep too many bees in those places.
And so as gardeners, I mean, I suppose I just really wanted to talk to you about this because you're such an expert. As gardeners, we have a huge bulk of land, don't we? And as farming becomes, unfortunately, more and more, well, let's hope, with changes recently in legislation, this might not go on forever, but it becomes like a field can become like a chemical laboratory. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just got so many different treatments. Bees aren't going to survive. So gardening becomes more and more critical in our gardens as a resource for wild bees. Will you tell us about that a little bit, about how important we are as gardeners, as a sort of call to arms for us all?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I grew up in a very agricultural area. I wanted to be a farmer, but I can remember really clearly growing up with the smell of insecticides and things floating across from the fields. You don't get that so much now, partly because of the different kinds of agrochemicals that are used. But I've noticed even where I am now, so we've been living here for 18 years, I've noticed in the local countryside the significant drop in the quantity of pollinators and other insects that are out there. And as you said, the agricultural land, I think things are getting better. I don't want to criticise farmers too much because really, who'd be a farmer? I mean, it's like gambling, isn't it? But I mean, that is the way that the food that we all eat and can afford is produced. But it's just not good. It's just not good for bees. If you take a typical, large agricultural field, It might be sprayed or received various chemicals multiple times in the year. It's surrounded by a hedge, which is just sort of cut to within an inch of life. It might as well be a barbed wire fence, quite frankly. And if it has a flowering crop on there, it might be something like, for example, oilseed rape. It will flower profusely for maybe a month a year, and the rest of the year, that 20 acres is no good whatsoever to any form of wildlife. It might as well be a concrete car park or something like that. And so that's why gardens are so important. I get in trouble sometimes for saying this, and I don't really mean it, but it might be better for wildlife if you took the average 20-acre field and covered it in a housing estate. With hundreds of small gardens. Each one will have a different range of plants and habitats in it, and there'll be small ponds and trees. And I mean, the odd garden will have astroturf and paving, and we might have to worry about that a bit. But there will be lots more places in there and they can in fact be a refuge. I mean, I've seen. Where I keep bees, I frequently see wild bees going from the fields over to the areas of housing, and the best honey crops will come from places where there are lots of houses and gardens, because the countryside just isn't a healthy place in most instances now for bees to live, unfortunately. So gardens they're a refuge, not just for us, but also for wildlife and for bees. They're so important, and I think people don't, we see the rolling countryside and think there's loads of space for wildlife, but there's lots and lots of space taken up by gardens. Over 20 million gardens, something 1.5 million acres maybe of garden in the UK, I think. A huge amount of space. And if that was used, even if some of it was used wisely and sensitively, it could make a huge difference. And many species of bee don't travel far.
Yeah.
I mean, honeybees might perhaps fly 3 miles to find flowers. Bumblebees, maybe it might be a kilometre or something like that. But many of the small solitary bees, which are minuscule, I mean, tiny, smaller than an ant, they will never fly more than maybe about 10 metres. So if they're nesting and surviving in your garden, and they may be just a small population of those in your area, because most bees aren't spread evenly across the country. They occur in little patches. And if one of those patches is where you live and it's your garden, that could be their refuge, and you could be keeping that population going. And if they thrive, they can spread out to your neighbours' gardens and perhaps the surrounding countryside.
Yes. Well, it's something that we talk about quite a bit on the podcast, is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which is this thing that gardens, you're creating disturbance the whole time. And so you've got such a mix of habitats, from trees to shrubs to bulbs to biennials to annuals, but all these different things. And I guess, that's very important for bird populations, but I guess it's also very important for bee populations too, isn't it?
Absolutely. One small garden can have, as you say, a range of different habitats. You've got different heights, you've got different kinds of soil, you've got maybe rockeries, trees, all sorts of things. So lots and lots of different environments. Most of them might have a hedge all the way around, and hedge habitat or edge habitat is the richest form of habitat for wildlife that there is. I mean, if you stand in a field, there may not be much wildlife. If you go into the heart of a wood, there may not be an awful lot of noticeable wildlife, but it's all living and thriving and breeding in those edges around the hedges.
Yeah.
So yes, that's definitely something that gardens can provide.
And so moving on to actually what we can do in our gardens. I always think of it, sort of food and water first, and then habitat. So could we move on to your main sort of prompts to us gardeners of, I don't know, like, how do we know whether something's a really good flower for bees? And sort of lawns, as I know, something that you feel passionate about. So I'd love you to chat a little bit about that.
Okay, well, you mentioned the most obvious thing, and that's great for gardeners because we love flowers, and so we can provide flowers for bees. But I think we all now know that some flowers are good for bees and some less so. That's largely down to the way that we've selectively bred them to be more appealing to us, but make them less useful to the bees. So the most obvious things are to go for flowers that are wide open, that the bees can access the nectar and the pollen. Okay, that's straightforward. After that, a good way, how do you know that a plant has got lots of pollen, has got lots of nectar? Well, one way of doing it is just simply to look. Go to your garden centre where there are things in flower, go to local gardens, visit your friends, see what's flowering and see what the bees are visiting. This actually isn't quite as simple as it seems because bees are quite fickle, and I'm sure you've noticed this yourself. One year you'll have a patch of flowers, it'll be covered in bees, and the next year you'll barely see them at all. And that's just because bees are very efficient and they found something elsewhere which is providing them better pollen. And also, just because a flower can provide pollen nectar doesn't necessarily mean it always does. So, for example, You may have a garden that's blooming absolutely beautifully in August, but you may see very few bees. Why might that be? It may be because it hasn't rained for a month. There's just not enough moisture in the soil, and so the plants aren't actually producing nectar.
Oh.
And that's one reason why non-native species of plants that are used to growing in drier environments often are now quite crucial, because they've evolved to produce nectar in dry conditions.
Oh, I never knew that. That's
so you were asking me before about some of the plants that I might recommend. So one thing I mentioned was eryngiums, the sea hollies, because they can grow in very well-drained soil where there may not be very much moisture, yet they still have the ability to produce nectar, especially towards the end of the year. Because bees are sometimes absolutely desperate by the time you get into August and September for some nectar in particular.
And so just to sort of go back a bit on that, so nectar is the carbohydrate, isn't it? And pollen is the protein.
That's right.
And they need both to remain healthy. And pollen, I mean, there are some plants that I grow at Perch Hill that seem only to have pollen, which are poppies.
That's right.
Is that right, that they don't have any nectar at all?
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
It's the same with roses. They'll just have the pollen, and the bees collect the pollen not for themselves. They will sometimes consume a small amount, but basically that's their source of proteins and vitamins and minerals and what have you. It's baby food. It's what they use to make their babies.
Right.
So for beekeepers, the first thing in spring is we want to see our bees flying in with lots of pollen, because although it's too early to open the hive, it indicates to us that there's life going on inside the hive. The queen is laying eggs and babies are being produced. Yeah, so pollen is vitally important, but the nectar is basically what they need. It's their fuel. I mean, they have to flap their wings hundreds of times a second. They need to produce heat and so on, and so that's provided by basically sugar, which is provided by nectar. And the plants produce nectar only for the bees. It's there as a lure. Come to me, come and get some nectar while you're here. Pick up some pollen and take that around.
Yeah. And water, I mean, obviously, so as we've just learnt, which is so fascinating, the plants need water to produce nectar, but also the actual bees need water. And it's a vast amount of water they need, don't they?
Honeybees certainly get through a huge quantity of water. They use water for several things in the hive. They use it to help regulate their environment. They can heat up the inside of the hive or cool it down accordingly. And the way that they cool it down is extraordinary. What one hive of bees, if it's very hot weather, and it's getting very warm inside and they want to cool it down, they will come out and find water, they'll suck it up, they'll bring it into the hive, they'll arrange it around the hive, and then they will arrange themselves around the hive so that they can flap their wings in a very efficient way, suck air into the hive, guide it around, it'll evaporate off the water and the warmth, and then they'll pump it out of the front of the hive, and they can cool down their hive in that way. So honeybees can collect up to 2 litres of water a day. Gosh. Which, when you think that each one is carrying the tiniest droplet in its stomach, and it may have flown miles to get it, it's very important. And at this time of year, we're talking now about late winter, water is very important, because honeybees are surviving on the honey that they collected last autumn. It has solidified or crystallized inside the hive. They can't actually consume honey like that. They like it nice and runny like we do. So they have to bring in water. They put the water on top of the crystallized honey, and it then soaks in and it liquidizes the honey. They've got a little scrubbing brush on the end of their tongue, which they can mix the water and honey up, make the the honey liquid enough, and then suck it in and consume it. So at this time of year, late winter, it's very important for honeybees in particular to be able to get access to warmish water. So if you are putting water out for the bees in your garden, try to keep it shallow.
Yeah.
Maybe in a dark container, and put it somewhere in the sun. So if there is any sun, it will warm the water up, and it won't chill them when they come down for it. Wild species of bee, bumblebees and solitaries, don't actually need a source of water. They get all the water they need from the nectar, because nectar is about 80% water.
Mm-hmm. And you know that thing, I mean, I remember as a child being taught that you could, if you saw what looked like an exhausted, perhaps almost dying bumblebee, you could somehow feed it sugar syrup. And I remember us putting like saucers, and I'm afraid I remember drowning a few bees by mistake by doing that. So can you guide us on that? Yeah,
it's so funny you say it, because this happened literally only yesterday.
Wow.
I went to see my parents down in Somerset, and they'd had a bee. Now, the first thing to say about that, it was a worker buff-tailed bumblebee. At the beginning of February, they shouldn't really be around. And this is what's happening increasingly because of our changing climate. We're getting warmer winters. Queen bees are waking up when they shouldn't. And often there'll be a warm few days. They'll come out. They'll do a bit of foraging. There aren't normally very many flowers or flowers that are easy to find at that time of year, so they can't get the energy they need. They can no longer work their muscles to produce heat. They get cold, and that's when you find them crawling around on the floor looking very sorry for themselves. So yeah, if you find a bee, they're usually queens, but that one yesterday was a worker. Pick them up. You can pick them up in your hand. They're not going to harm you, but if you're a bit worried, you can use a sheet of paper or a dust and brush or something.
Glass.
Bring them indoors, pop them in a shoebox, something like that. Just mix up some white table sugar with a bit of warm water to make a thick syrup, and put that in front of them. You can put it on a little sponge or something like that, and you'll see the tongue coming out, and you'll see the back end of the bee moving actually pumps. It's a little pump. You'll see them sucking the nectar in. It takes only a few minutes. You'll see them coming to life, giving themselves a little shake and looking. It's like them having a can of Red Bull or something. They've just instantly got this hit of energy, and very often though they've got cold, and the hair will be clumped together and they'll be damp. So what you can do then is go and get your hairdryer. Now, before you switch it on, make sure it's on its lowest setting, or she'll be flying a lot sooner than you expect. Stand well back and just put a little bit of warm air in it, and you'll see the hair fluffing up, and you can see them stretching. I had one once. It loved it so much, it actually turned its back and lifted its leg up to get a little bit of air under there, and it turned around and got that. You could see it going, oh yeah, this is nice. And then suddenly they get the heat, their muscles working, and whoop, off they go. They'll fly up and just open the window and let them out. And you can feel, you might feel a bit soppy doing this for one bee, but you're not saving a bee. She's probably a queen, and she's going to go off and establish a whole nest and a dynasty of bees. So you saved one bee, but you may have saved thousands.
Absolutely. And so February flowers, and sort of late winter, early spring flowers are incredibly important, aren't they, for the queen bees? So, you mentioned eryngiums, which of course won't be flowering yet, but have you got one or two other really key plants that we should all think of planting for exactly the early part of the year?
Yeah, so I'll mention a couple of things. I give quite a lot of talks to non-gardening groups, and so I say, if you're not really a gardener, it's still very easy to do this. Just say that each year you'll spend £5 or £10 on bulbs. Plant that amount. That's your bit done for the bees. Each year, buy some when you see them in the supermarket. Put them in the garden. So we're talking about crocuses, snowdrops, bluebells, scillas, winter aconites, things like that are going to flower at this time of the year. And of course, they'll come back every year and they'll multiply. And if you buy another bag next year, you'll soon fill your garden. Then give them to the grandchildren. Do a bit of guerrilla gardening. Put them out on the side of the road, whatever. And they're there for a long time. And they're there just when the bees really do need it. So the snowdrops are out at the moment. And in some warmer weather, a couple of days ago, I saw honeybees on them. And winter aconites have a lovely thing. Their waxy petals actually collect little pools of water, and they reflect the sun onto that water and warm it up. So the honeybees can come there and get nice warm water, because cold water is really problematic for them.
Okay.
Another thing I would suggest at this time of year, willows are great.
Yes.
Still a little bit early.
So much pollen.
They're just stacked with pollen. You have male and female trees. Pussy willow is the one we see out in the hedgerows. If you go and stand by one of those when it's flowering, it'll be absolutely humming with bees. So you'll have honeybees, often queen bumblebees. There's a couple of species of solitary bee that rely almost entirely on willow. It's one of the only plants that they will visit, so it's important for them early in the year. And you'll get the butterflies that have just woken up, nectaring up and on there. So, if you spot a pussy willow out, on a walk, notice which ones are the males, the ones with the catkins. Take some cuttings and put those in your garden in the hedge. They're a bit of a big, unwieldy sort. They're not really a pretty garden tree, but you can get. I think it's Salix Caprea Kilmarnock is a weeping version, which will go in a small garden.
And I love Mount Asso, which is the pink. Rather than having a yellow pollen, it's got a pink pollen, so it's got this beautiful soft pink cloud over it.
That's right.
I love that.
I think Daphnoides is another nice one if you want something a bit more ornamental in the garden. That's a lovely. So there are ornamental willows, but so willows are really great. They're just they happen at that time of year when bees are really needing something, and a vast quantity. A tree. People often don't tend to think of trees for bees. Tend to concentrate on the flowers in the border. But a large tree in flowers, like a meadow in the sky, it can have thousands of flowers and be hugely useful to bees. I
remember walking under lime trees again when I was a child. There was a lime tree in my parents' garden, and the absolute din of bees when they flower? Sort of July, is it? In Scotland, this was. And
so usually in the UK, down in England, it's about mid-June, something like that.
Yeah.
But different species flower at a slightly different time.
Yeah, and it's just, as well as that smell, you got the amazing noise of all the bees. And so
lime honey, delicious.
Yeah, lime honey. So then moving on to lawns, which is something that an awful lot of gardens have, and how we can make lawns more bee-friendly.
Yeah, I find lawns really frustrating because they take up a large part of most people's gardens. I mean, the typical thing is, a lawn with a border around the outside. If you could turn that inside out and have a border and, have all your plants in the middle and a bit of grass around the outside, that would be perfect. But if people like lawns, and they are a great way of framing the garden, they're a great sort of foil for all the other plants, of course. But it's just such an awful waste of space. And the process of producing what would traditionally be called a perfect lawn, it just doesn't help wildlife at all. It often involves chemicals and all that sort of stuff. So there is a bit of a trend now for doing lawns in a different way. And I know people worry about it because it can look a bit unkempt and so on. So my advice is to firstly try to establish more flowers in your lawn. It's surprising if you cut it less frequently how many wildflowers do emerge. But you can go and get wildflower seeds. It's not illegal to collect them as long as they're not rare species, and plant them up in the autumn and make some plug plants and then get those into your garden, into your lawn in the spring. In terms of a mowing regime, what I tend to do is I mow normally after the winter, get rid of that horrible sort of thatch and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then the wildflowers that are in there, and I've got, I've counted 25 different species of flowering plant in my lawn. It's a completely normal, kind of lawn other than that. Mow up until about the end of March, then let it grow. And then often you'll get a lovely bloom in about June with clovers and vetches and even things
Daisies.
like knapweed, which normally flower at 3 foot. If you cut them regularly, it's like bonsai, you'll have a little 3-inch high knapweed. That's one of the great bee plants. Let it flower. Then when most of the flowers are over, and I judge it by the white clover, when all those lovely white petals have dropped down and the skirt has all gone brown and droopy looking, it's not much good there for the bees. Then put your lawnmower on the highest setting. Basically, you're deadheading all those flowers. A week or two later, they'll start to flower again. You'll get a second flush. That's normally over by about mid-July, and then you can go back to cutting your lawn as normal. So you can still have that nice, neat-looking lawn that you want, but there are times when you can have this. And one of the things that's really amazing is, a lawn with flowers on it, just the most beautiful jewelled tapestry, so pretty. But the smell of a lawn, you remember that lovely smell of a proper old-fashioned hay meadow? It's just sweet and grassy and lovely. Well, that smell is what you get from your lawn when it's in flower. So the bees will visit it. But not only that, you're giving bees who like to nest in lawns an opportunity to nest in peace. So many solitary bees are mining bees, and they will dig small holes in your lawn, which is great for the quality of your soil. They're not going to do any harm whatsoever, and they will have a chance to nest. It only takes them a few weeks to build their tunnels down into the ground and to provision them with pollen and nectar and seal them, and then that's the end of it. So if you give them a bit of peace and quiet during then, you get things like the tawny mining bee, which is just the most pretty bee you can ever. It's like a little flying fox, the most gorgeous gingery tawny colour on the top and lovely jet black underneath. You get ashy mining bees, which are these lovely little black and white bees and so on. So these are all species that like to nest in lawns in areas with short grass. So some people go as far as actually putting a blade of the mower really low on certain patches and scuffing the grass so there's a little bit of mud. If you've got children and they'd like to play football and there's an area where perhaps where there's a goal and it's the grass is bare, don't despair. It might not look as nice as you like as a lawn, but it'll be a place where bees will probably nest.
Oh, I love the way you've segued into habitat now. That's very, very neat. So one of the things that I really liked in your book is how you can make bee hotels that work rather than having to buy them. And actually, there's great evidence, isn't there, that the bought ones really aren't as effective because they're too uniform. So can we just talk about not just forage and not just water, but then also how you can enhance the habitat as well as in your lawn, but what we can do as gardeners to give them more places to live.
Of course, we naturally think of flowers. That's what we want to think of because we're gardeners and we want to grow things that we love as well. But your garden's not just a diner, it's a place for bees to live and to breed. We often see bees, they just fly and visit the flower, off they go. Well, where do they go and what are they doing? Well, they're going about their lives. They're taking advantage of what is a really very brief window of good weather and availability of food in order to nest and reproduce. And they'll be doing this in your garden, probably without you even realising.
Yeah.
So the most obvious ones are when you put up a bee hotel, and as you mentioned, they're often not very good. There are some good bought ones. If you buy them from a company that specialises in selling conservation materials and wildlife stuff, often they are a good quality. But if you buy a sort of one that you see in supermarkets and often garden centres, that they're not really great. But you can make your own bee hotels. You can buy cardboard tubes and put them in boxes.
Yeah.
You basically, what you need is a range of different sizes of holes, anything from 2 millimeters, which is tiny, up to sort of 8 or 10 millimeters. So your mason bees and leaf cutters will use the larger size ones. Things like lovely little yellow-headed bees will go in tiny little holes. You can cut reed and straw and put them in a bee hotel, and they'll nest in those. The key thing with bee hotels is to put them somewhere south-facing so they get the sun. I've lost count of the number of people, people buy them, put them up in a tree. Well, it's in the shade or it's on a north-facing wall. Put them in the sun, put them at about head height, which is mainly because you can see them. They're great fun to watch. You can get some great ones where you can actually pull them out, little drawers. You can pull the drawers out and they have perspex. You need to make sure you do it after the bees have finished nesting, but you can actually see all the cocoons and so forth inside. And the other thing to bear in mind is you want quite small nest boxes. Sometimes you see enormous ones that people put into parks and whatnot. Well, that's not normal and that's not healthy. Bees don't nest in huge... Some of them nest in aggregations, close by to one another, but generally they nest singly in odd places. If you put loads and loads together, it's like putting them in a housing project or something, and it's going to spread disease and so on. The other thing to bear in mind is you often see bee hotels that are they look abandoned and they're not used by bees and they're rotting away. They do need some maintenance. So if you put up a bee hotel and all is well, you'll notice in the first year there might be a handful of bees using it. Second year you'll see lots. Third year loads and loads. But then suddenly they're not using it. The population collapses. So you need to manage them because parasites and various things can build up.
Like with anything.
Yeah, so unfortunately it does, it would be nice just to buy one, pop it on the wall, think job done, but you need to learn really how to manage them. It's not a lot of work, but you can get ones where the tubes can be removed. You can keep them in the shed over winter, and then you bring them out when it's time for the bees to emerge. You can put them in I put the nest box or the tubes in a dark bucket with a lid on it, just with one hole, and the bees will emerge from the nest and come up to the light out of the hole. And then when they all emerged from the nest, you can clean out the nest or replace the tubes or what have you, and then put it back on the wall. But it just means they're not reusing the same materials year after year.
Oh, excellent. And of course now at this time of year when people are kind of tidying the garden and getting ready for spring, it's a really good time to look at, as you're cutting down your Stipa gigantea or whatever, you will have all those different diameters of plant material, basically, won't you?
That's right. Anything that's hollow and twiggy and straight and quite long, about at least 6 inches long.
Okay, good.
Ideal. Collect those up and put them into... You can even use old squash bottles and things like that if you want. Put some in, hang it up. Don't hang it so that it swings around. They don't like that. Put it somewhere where it's solid and in one place. So if we've got time, I'll just mention that a lot of bees also, of course, nest in the ground. So you need to be aware of that. So and they like different kinds of ground. So some like clay ground, some like gravelly, sandy ground, and so on. So if you've got bare patches of soil and ground in your garden, it can be in your borders. It can be in pathways. I've got a lovely little solitary bee called Lasioglossum moro, which is the most beautiful iridescent petrol green colour. Absolutely shines, but they're tiny, and they nest in my gravel path. So just be aware of the fact that bees do need different kinds of environments in the ground where they can put their burrows and nests. But generally, they need sun. They need to have sunlight on them.
You see, I'm ashamed to say I didn't know that. Anyway, as you can tell, everyone, Richard is just. I could talk to him all day, honestly, but I do passionately recommend his book, Beekeeping for Gardeners, just because it's such a source, an encyclopedia of information, and it's not. I think it would be a challenge to read it from cover to cover because there's just so much information here. But it's something to dip into, and I've got it by my bed, and I pick it up, and the stuff on identifying bees I've found really exciting. And actually, one of the things that he suggests is keeping a journal, and it's given me. I know we're out of the bang into the new year now, but it's given me a new resolution for 2025, which is that I want by the end of this year to be able to identify 20 of our wild bees in the garden at Perch Hill. And me and the team of gardeners at Perch, we're going to keep a bee journal. And whenever any of us see one that we don't know, well, one, we're going to try and photograph it. But it's just what I feel about everything. And obviously with me, it started with plants and wildflowers. But if you get to know something, then you care about it. And so for us, 2025 is going to be about getting to know our wild bees. And that has been largely inspired by Richard and the book. And so I'm incredibly grateful. But there isn't an equivalent Merlin app to birds, is there, Richard?
Currently, no. Unfortunately, there are some apps which are a little bit useful, but bees are very tricky to identify. You're much better off getting a book, getting a large net and a collecting pot. It's fine to collect bees if you're very, very careful. Pop them into a pot, have a look at them, maybe take a photograph. Unfortunately, even the greatest bee experts can't tell the difference between some of them. But as you mentioned, you wanted to identify about 20, and it's actually quite easy, I think, to find 20 quite common bee species. They'll be in your garden regularly for a month or more. So there's about 8 species of bumblebee and the rest, which will be solitary bees, which are fairly distinctive. Unfortunately, there are loads and loads that just look the same. It's like the bird equivalent of a little brown job.
Yes.
You just don't really know what they're... And of course, they're moving all the time. You know, you spot one, and by the time you get to the flower, it's off.
Yeah. Good. Oh, well, it's so nice to talk. And I really hope everyone, well, as many as you as can and have a garden, are going to make bees part of it and concentrating on them in 2025. And thank you so much, Richard, for joining us and for giving us that inspiration.
Thank you, Sarah. Such fun. It's so nice on a grey, dull February day when there's not a bee in sight to be talking to you about them, and in the knowledge that hopefully in a month or two we'll start seeing them in our gardens.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for listening to Grow Coquita Range with Richard Rickitt, who has a new book out right now. Fantastic encyclopedia of bee knowledge, both honey and wild bees. I love talking to him. Next week, I'm on my own, and I'm actually starting a new sort of mini-series within the year of walking around the garden and picking what's looking lovely and noticeable, maybe 10 or 12 things each time. And then I'm going to talk about them and why I've grown them and where they're growing, how to grow them, why I love them. And so I'm going to try and do that every sort of 4 to 6 weeks, all the way through the year in 2025. And so the first one will be next week. So join me then. You can find more information, photos and advice sheets on all the plants and recipes we talk about on this podcast by heading to the show notes or at sarahraven.com/podcast.